really like to do, right? So that's rarely the case for most people, right? But unfortunately, or fortunately, giving talks, giving presentations are a big part of what you've kind of signed up for in terms of being graduate students, but more importantly, going beyond that, whether you give a job talk, right, or you're presenting your research, telling everyone what you did, right? You really don't get that. No one knows what you did if you don't tell them, and it's an important part of communication as a scientist. And so I've kind of put together this talk to try to help you out. And so let me just start off with where this is coming from. And so I have to give a lot of credit to Ken Suslick, who put together a talk, and he's done this continually. You can go and look up his talk online. It's a very meta kind of thing. He gives a presentation about giving a seminar on seminars, right? And he's done it for more than 20 years, and it's really quite refined at this point. So I saw some very early versions of this, but you can go and look up more recent ones. And I've actually borrowed some things from him and some quotes from him from that talk, right? I found a pretty good website where they give some advice on giving presentations, more about the design of presentations. But really the bulk of what I'm going to be talking to you about, or the advice I'll be giving you is basically from personal experience. And I would say that when I was a graduate student, I was probably the bottom 10% in terms of quality of presentations. It was just a frightening experience for myself and anybody else who was watching me. All right, it was really a horribly, I would say, painful experience. But it's really kind of transformed as I've got a better understanding of what I'm doing, and then also getting more comfortable speaking. And this really comes with practice. And I think that transition has really helped me kind of think about things that, made it so painful, made it so difficult, made my presentations really poor. But also from the other point of view, I'm now sitting in the audience most of the times when people are giving talks, and I've watched a lot of presentations, especially from students, and they're like widely varying in quality, I would say. And sometimes I'm kind of sitting through one of these painful presentations thinking, didn't someone explain to them how to do this? And the answer was no. We really, for the most part, don't explain how do you give a presentation, or give you some advice or some guidelines of what's a good presentation, or what makes a good presentation. And so that was kind of the impetus for putting this together, right? It's so that when I'm sitting out there, I'll get to see higher quality presentations. This might help. So there's going to be basically an outline of what we're going to cover today. Just talk generally about presentation content and organization. Most presentations are done with slides, so we'll talk a little bit about slide design, and then also finally wrap that up with some presentation skills. Okay? So this is a lot to pack into approximately an hour, so we're going to kind of go through these kind of quickly. So the first thing you really need to decide when you're giving a presentation is who is your target audience? Who's going to be watching this talk? So you can't give the same talk to a conference, maybe to a general public, right? Or in your group meeting. You may give very different versions of the same talk, right? So you really need to think about them, especially like if you're doing it for some exam, your oral exam, your thesis defense, or you're giving your job talk. The people watching it are different, their level of understanding of your material is different, and what they're looking for, what they're trying to get out of that presentation, may be quite different. So really think about it from the point of view of the audience, right? What are they expecting? Are they expecting to say, how much did you do? Do you understand what you did? Or do they just want to understand the topic of research that you're working on? What is it that they're trying to get out of the talk? And then you should kind of tailor, obviously, the content and the terminology to whoever you decided is the audience, right? And so you're not going to use the same terms, maybe, same descriptions. You may simplify them, or you may get into more technical detail, depending on who the audience is, right? And really, I kind of touched on this a second ago. It's like, what is that purpose of the talk? Is it just simply to educate and entertain people? Are they trying to evaluate your communication skills or your research productivity, right? Your understanding of the research, right? Or maybe in a job talk, it's some combination of these kinds of things, right? So depending on what the audience is expecting, those are things that you need to work into your talk, right? So I've kind of grouped together the general strategies for preparing a talk into two camps. And this is how I think about them. And there's two extremes. There's one that you take a kind of a subset of your data and you try to tell a story, right? And but it may be a very narrow subset, or it certainly won't be all of what you did, right? And the other one is what I call the shock and awe strategy, where you just try to overwhelm them with the amount of things that you did, and you try to show as much as you can and pack it into the talk. I'll say that I fall into this category in terms of my strategy, but I've seen other people do this one quite well. They're both effective strategies. So just to kind of put my cards on the table, I'm going to tell you about this one, and it's not to say that this one doesn't work, but I'm going to be talking more about this strategy and try to make a case for this one, right? This is another quote from Ken Selznick, who's like, don't try to impress, try to inform, all right? And so I think when you're trying to impress, you go toward this direction, and when you're trying to inform, you go toward that direction. And so I think he's saying something very similar here. But sometimes you do want to impress. Maybe you want to have some element of this in your talk as well. Very good. Yeah. So here's some key things that you want to have in your talk, right? So it should be able to communicate your ideas, your arguments, your conclusions, right? So you have something to say, and you're able to communicate those things, your ideas, the things that you discover, the things that you've learned, all right? This second one is very important. You need to persuade the audience that the things that you discover, your conclusions, are really true, right? That they should believe those. You want to provide some supporting arguments, some data to support these conclusions and arguments or ideas, right? I think it's helpful to think about this whole process as that you're trying to teach the audience, right? And if you take the role as a teacher, then you'll understand that I need to explain things, right? We're not just going to memorize a whole set of facts or look at a lot of data. You want to teach them something. And ultimately, many times for you, like if you're in a job talk or you're giving your oral presentation, you're trying to show your productivity, right? And you want to highlight or demonstrate your communication skills. So, right. So when you think about organizing your talk, or when I think about organizing my talk, the first thing I think about are what are the takeaways I want the audience to have. So when they leave your talk, what will they have learned? Right? And I'd like to try to encapsulate that into 2, 3, or 4 things, right? But I learned that we can make this new thing. This new thing has some interesting properties, or this new approach that you developed can solve an important problem, right? Those are the kinds of things you want to think about and structure your talk about that. So obviously there's going to be a lot of data in there, hopefully, right? There'll be a lot of other things, but at its core, you want to think about what are the takeaways from your talk, right? And then structure your talk around this. And so this can be quite complicated, especially if you have multiple projects, right? Like sometimes I've seen a talk, a friend of ours who he put a blank slide in the middle of his talk, and then he said, okay, that's my awkward transition slide. And he just moved to a second project. There was no connection between the two, all right? A good talk can also make connections, and it can be like just a silly connection. It could be a joke, right? Just to connect the two projects together, right? But it's helpful to think about, are there some unifying concepts that go through the multiple projects that I want to present? And that can help the audience follow along, right? And show some continuity. And I'm often thinking about that, like, okay, I want to show these several projects. What's some common element that I can talk about at the very beginning of the introduction? And then that common element will appear in each of these projects, right? That's not always possible, but I think if you can do that, that can really help you out and make your talk more cohesive. And with respect to that, like, it's very easy to lose the thread when you're trying to compile all your data in there and put everything into your talk that you think you want to put in there. I often go back to writing a short abstract or the list of key conclusions or takeaways from the talk and say, does this data support one of these conclusions, right? Or does it not? Or are there stronger ones out there that I should be spending more time on? And this data here, yes, I know it took me 6 months to get. This other piece of data took me a day. Maybe the one that took a day is a stronger argument, right? Or more easy to understand, right? And so I think keeping you focused by, writing out those key conclusions and then going back and trying to evaluate as you're making your presentation how the individual slides match up with those conclusions. So a thing I often see is this type of outline. And what is the problem with this outline? It's quite universal, but why is this problematic? Or why do I feel like it's problematic as an outline? The problem is, like, I could drop this into any talk, right? Any talk, right? And so what's the point of it, right? It doesn't give us any new information, right? So this kind of outline is the opportunity to, list the conclusions, right? And I like this line from Ken Sussek. He has a good name, so I agree with him, of course. But tell them what you're going to tell them. So that's the outline, right? Tell them what you're going to tell them. Tell them, so that's the body we're taught. And then tell them what you told them, right? If it's so important, right, these conclusions, you can repeat things. And that repetition will help them remember what you told them, right? So, but kind of breaking this down a little bit more finely, so what, instead of, introduction, there's like, what is your story? What are the key conclusions that you want to tell them, right? Why should they care? To me, this is what the introduction should be. Like, okay, I'm going to tell you this story. Why should you care about this story? Why is this interesting? Why is this impactful, right? And then the body of it's going to be like, well, how did I come to these conclusions? What data, what arguments do I have to support those conclusions? Why should you believe me, okay? And that's what the body of the talk will be. And the last section, you're going to wrap up. You tell them what you told them, and they maybe look at some kind of future things like, well, what does this mean? Where can we go from here? How could this be useful? Right? Could this be applied to some other interesting problems or questions? And you'll notice most of these they all are questions, right? And so I'm really big on answering questions, right? And so in a talk, you want to pose questions and hopefully provide the answers to these questions. Sure. So I would say that one of the most challenging or annoying things, I would say, that in a lot of presentations is that they don't tell you what the talk is going to be about. Honestly, you get lots and lots of introduction. They don't tell you why they're telling you this introduction and background. And somewhere at the end of that, they'll sneak in, oh, this is what this talk will be about, right? And sometimes you miss it, right? So really, I think it's really important to stay upfront and literally maybe on the first or second slide, what is your talk going to be about, right? What is your research goal? What is your project about, right? And state that really clearly and quite upfront. You may just write it out, right? And the reason is we end up with these detective stories of like, well, they showed me lots of data, but what was the purpose of all of this, right? And a lot of people want to go for like this surprise ending, like, oh, I'll show you all this data, and then we'll come to this magical conclusion at the end, right? Well, most people aren't going to have that attention span to get to the end, right? So don't leave your audience wondering what is going to happen next. Yeah, you want to have a little bit of suspense. Like maybe the suspense will be, I'm going to tell you about how we made something. And so the suspense is like, I wonder how they made that, So, but it shouldn't be a suspense about what the goals of the project is. What are, right? And so a lot of this, I think, comes about this long introductions and things like that, or kind of withholding that the purpose is people they don't feel confident in their story, right? They're like, I'm not sure my research is so good, so I'm going to have to show, 10-slide introduction to validate just my idea in the first place, right? And that makes sense, right? You're probably new to this, so I think it's a reasonable emotion to have, but it leads to this problem, right? And so, be confident in what your story is, because it literally it's the story that the audience came to hear. They came to see you, right? And they want to hear your story, right? So you should tell them that story, right, from the beginning, right? And kind of things to think about to help you get going on this is like, these are ways of how you solved or answered an important question or problem. Really, that's what most research is about, right? And whether you're demonstrating some new approach, or you're making something new, or you have something which has some new and interesting properties, or maybe you have a new methodology, right? That's the story you're going to tell. So, so the second part, once you've told them, what is your project, what is your goal, what is the goal of the presentation, you want to say, like, why should you care? Why is this interesting? You do need some justification, right? And so for me, that's what the introduction and background are, is to provide that justification of like, yes, this is interesting, this is useful, this is impactful, right? And so you may have to include a little bit about, some explanation of some technical details, because maybe the approach you use is quite unusual, right? But, at its core, in the introduction and background, I'm trying to answer these questions like, why is this interesting or useful? How is this different or novel but from what's been done before? What is that knowledge gap that this fulfills? What are some unique advantages? So yes, it's new, but there are a lot of new things. Just being new is not enough. Like, why is this? What can I do with this new thing that you've developed? Why will it make my life better, or why will I learn something new to be able to use it or understand it, right? And so, these are my background in introductions really focused on answering these questions, and a lot of that purpose is to try to keep it short. You want to keep it quite compact, especially if you're new. You've read a lot of papers. You want to give yourself credit for reading all those papers. You want to tell us all about those papers. That's wonderful, but that's not what the audience came to hear. They came to hear about your research, right? they can go and look up that other stuff. You may need to mention some things here and there, but try to keep it brief. Right. So for most talks, I don't see much problem with the data presentation. Most people are quite willing to put data into the talk. That's good, but how you present that data is very important, right? And so you can just show, for example, I've been to talks where they just show slide after slide of micrographs and spectra and X-ray structures, one after another, and so it gets quite boring because they haven't really organized in a way where they're saying, here's my data that, gives support for this conclusion or this argument, or from this data, I can make these types of conclusions, right? And what they're doing is really making the connection between the experimental results that they're showing and whatever conclusions or key points that you're trying to get across, right? So how did I come to this conclusion? How did I solve this problem? And the data will support that. So it's not just, I have this goal, I did a lot of experiments, therefore I have achieved my goal. But you need to draw the connections between each of those activities, all right? You're trying to use the data to argue that, yes, you should believe these conclusions that I've set out at the beginning. You should right? And so in the last part, yes, this is the conclusion or summary. You'll restate what just happened, right? What were those conclusions that you came to? That's fine. Right? And then, I think a good conclusion will also kind of peek into the future. It's like, what's the next step? Where can we go with this? What could be the impact of this research, right? You don't want to put all your cards on the table maybe because that's what you're working on now or so forth. But, I think a good conclusion will have something, and obviously you want to have some acknowledgements, right? So that's basically the outline for your there. Those are the core components. So in terms of when I'm trying to plan out my presentation, what is the story? What is the goal of your research? That's actually up front, and I try to do that in the first 1 or 2 slides, okay? Just really up front. Maybe they don't have enough understanding at this point to fully grasp this, that's fine, but at least you told them what your objective is, and as you tell them more information, they'll understand the context of why you're telling them this. Why are they giving me all this background? Oh, they told me that the goal of this project is this, and so it's related to that, or around that. And then this is my background or introduction where I'm trying to explain why should you care about this? Why is this interesting? Why could this be useful? And then the vast majority of it, you can see that I try to keep this as short as possible, right? Is your data and how that data supports your story, all right? What is the thread that goes through? You're gonna now tell the story, right? With your data. And then finally wrap up this. The key point is here that you want this to be the vast majority of your talk. And if possible, minimize these things here. Okay? They're important, they need to be there. And in fact, keeping them short makes them more focused and then people will remember them, right? If one section goes on and on and on, if this goes on and on, they're like, where's the data, right? So, all right, so let's kind of look at this from another point of view and think about like some common errors. And I've mentioned quite a few of them already. And that's the first one, is just taking too long to get to the point, right? Get to the point in terms of what is your research goal, get to the point in showing your data, all right? So majority of your talk should be your research, not somebody else's research, right? So you want to get to that as and the body of the talk should be about your research, right? This is a big one. Like, people state their goal, but their goal is really not their goal. as far as I can understand. So what I mean by that is like, they might say, my goal is to end world hunger, right? So when you're saying that, what you're saying is, at the end of this talk, I will have an explanation for you about how I'm going to end world hunger. That's not going to happen, probably, right? That's probably the context of your talk. And you're going to address some small element within that larger context or that bigger problem. But you'll narrow that down to a very specific problem that you're going to address or try to address in your talk, right? So often when people say my goal is, okay, there's an energy crisis out there, we need more sources of energy, I'm going to solve that. Well, you're going to solve a small piece of that, right? So you need to make that clear. So when we say goal, or when I say goal, it means at the end of the talk, I will tell you a solution, an answer to that question, right? And so think about your goal more narrowly with respect to your overall project. Okay. And really think about it from the point of view of like, from my data, these are my conclusions, and those conclusions can maybe satisfy a larger goal, right? What is that goal? Right? That my data will directly support. You often want to include as much as you can. That's the understanding. But if you take that too far, then you start introducing things that don't really fit your story, all right? Or you may spend more time on things that are kind of minor points or discrepancies or whatever, right? And take away from the overall talk. And so you really want to go back to, this is where I said that making that list of key points and conclusions is quite helpful in evaluating, like, should I spend more time on this slide? Should I spend less time on the slide? Should I remove this slide? No. I like quotes, but yeah, it's easy to make things complicated. It takes a genius to make it simple, right? And we've seen that with teachers. Like, it's the same content. You'll have one teacher giving it, and you're like, yeah, they'll give you the same material, but one teacher can somehow make you understand that, right? Highlight the important things, right? Tell you how to get from here to there, right? Make those connections. See. So, in terms of this impulse to put more in it, I would rather have them like walking away, thinking, oh, I want to learn some more. I have some questions. That's better than having them kind of not knowing what happened because they were just deluged with all of this material. Right, so we're going to kind of transition to spending a little time talking about the technical details and some making slides, and we can do a whole presentation on this, so I'll try to keep this kind of short. So there are several elements to a slide. You should have a title, right? So just don't slap up data up there. I'm gonna have some titles. We'll talk more about this title. You should have some graphics, right? That was hard for me in this talk because there aren't too many graphics about giving presentations. But I tried to put some graphics in there because, this style of presentation, yes, I could just start reading stuff off a slide, but I could just as easily hand out stuff and you could get the same information, right? So, and having pictures really is the value of giving a presentation. You can communicate a lot more with pictures. So you want to have pictures, if possible, on every slide. Yeah. And I would say people get carried away with this, that they put way too much on one slide. So we'll talk about in a second. So I like to have like 4 structures or less, 4 molecules or less, 2 plots or less on a slide, right? That may seem quite minimal. I'll try to explain why I think that's a good idea. You want to have some text that kind of helps explain the slide or the pictures, right? You want to have your key conclusions that the data supports. Sometimes they'll be down here. Sometimes they can be up in the title. A title is a really good place to put these, right? Like, what does this data mean, right? What key conclusions can we draw from this? And then don't forget, like, there'll often be references whether maybe the data is taken from some other place or maybe it's from something you've published. give yourself credit. Put the references in. Fetch. Oh, I've actually, I used to not think slide numbers were that useful, but actually they are quite useful, I think, in terms of when people ask questions. It's like, oh, on slide 20, you have this picture and what, so they can ask questions. And it's also kind of useful as you're making it to kind of keep track of what's going on and pacing yourself. Oh, okay. So I'm kind of a minimalist in slides, and the idea behind that is I try to have one concept per slide. And the idea is like you can put a slide with lots of different data, and then you're going to go through them kind of like a poster that you might do. You might go through the whole slide and work your way through. The problem with that is like when you're up here, you're nervous, time seems to go a lot faster, and you just skip stuff, right? You just skip stuff, and you're like, oh, I forgot to talk about this, or I forgot to talk about that, right? But if you only put one slide per concept, right, or one concept per slide, right, then you can't skip it because you hit next slide and you're like, okay, I have to go over that one concept. You hit the next slide, you have to go over that concept, so you don't end up skipping anything, all right? And so it's one of the reasons why when you practice a talk and then when you actually give it, it's often so much shorter. The time seems to go so much faster because you skip so much, right? And so I think this really helps slow you down and make sure that you cover everything you had planned, right? And that going to the next slide will help you remember, oh, I wanted to talk about this, right? And maybe the title will jog you or remind you, right? So basically the talk gives itself at that point, right? And in terms of titles, okay? So big fan of titles, but titles are, I would say there are good titles and bad titles. And what I mean by bad titles is they're often descriptive. They'll say things like, this is an NMR spectra of this, or this is a crystal strength. Yeah, we can see that, right? But a better title would be something like, this is how we know that, our molecule makes this interaction, right? So it's the problem that you're solving, or it's the answer to the question that the data answers, right? So those are better titles, right? So, and those are also the concepts that you're trying to get across. So the title may not just be for the audience, it could be for you. You don't forget to talk about that. So for me, one kind of piece of advice I've given to the students in my group in the past is like, make all your titles questions, and that the data on the slide is the answer to that question. Okay. Now, when you get more advanced, that looks a little bit weird to have all your titles as questions, but the idea is there that you're trying to get across some concept and the link between the data and the conclusions. Well, and you want to have that link in there. So some kind of technical details on advice on making slides. So yeah, colors are fun, but it's easy to get carried away, right? I would say, 2 colors other than black and white. That's what I try to stick to. Sometimes I get thinking that, but it gets kind of crazy after a while. If you start adding more, you have to be really aware by the fact that projectors are very washed out versus your laptop screen. Your laptop screen is so much better than the projector. Things that look so good on your laptop screen look terrible on a projector. So like this is yellow. You can't see it. Like on your laptop, it would look perfectly fine, right? So you really want to go to very dark colors. So this is like a dark red or dark blue. Even the primary colors, this is not primary green. Green and yellow are the worst, I would say. I would try to avoid them, especially on white backgrounds. I'm kind of picky on this thing. Fonts, so there are actually two types of fonts. There are fonts that have they get thicker and thinner, right? These are called serif fonts, like Times New Roman is this typical example. And then there's these sans serif fonts. So these are fonts that are uniform in size all the way through to letters. And maybe you never really paid attention to that, but these are actually the same font size, okay? And these are going to be much more easy to see because they don't get narrow and thin, right? They're more uniform. These are much easier to read, and I recommend using these. So don't change fonts, but it's usually not you don't do it on purpose, but just the defaults come up and different fonts come up into your, just go back through your presentations and try to make all your fonts uniform. Because it makes weird things happen, makes it harder to read. And the last thing is like text size. So you guys have really good eyes compared to most people who are judging you in bodies. In other words, they're going to be older than you, okay? This is 18 point, all right? It looks fine on the screen probably. Well, not for me, but probably for you, okay? It's not visible. Can you guys read that? You can, right? So, like, I'm up here and I can't see it. So, even 24 point is pretty small. It's only when you get to like 32, and that's a big font. It looks huge on your laptop, all right? And so, just because it looks good on the screen of your laptop, you really need to think about what the font size is. You guys will compete. I've seen people really have cool slides where they have blue or dark backgrounds, and I've tried that before, and if you can do it, it's really cool. I like it. It's so much work. I do not recommend it. And the reason why it's so much work is, for example, like if you just take a blue background and you start writing black text, you cannot see it, right? So you have to like invert the text to a lighter color, right? But then when you start pasting in structures like this, depending upon how you paste it in, whether it has a transparent background or doesn't have a transparent background, it becomes really obvious, right? And some of the things will have transparent backgrounds and some of them no, right? And then it'll be totally inconsistent, and plots look like this, which you might as well have a white background at this point, right? So it's really tricky. You'd have to spend a lot of extra time if you're going to use a dark background, and I think your time is probably better spent elsewhere. If you want to do it, that's fine, but just be aware that there are these issues. Especially if you take images from different places, like you cut and paste from somewhere in the literature, it's going to look like this, right? Or you take it from other presentations or graphics that people give you, right? And then you're going to have to try to make this into a transparent background, which if you're really good at it, you probably could do, but it's tricky. The other thing that I really like about white backgrounds is that you can hide stuff really easily. So, like, I'll take an image and there's like, from a paper, and it has like A, B, C, D on it, and like I don't want them. So I can put it up here and then just put a white box over the top of the A, B, C, D. And you can't see the white box, right? But it hides those things, right? And so I can crop things, but I also can hide elements in a picture that way, really easy. It's kind of probably not the most professional way to do it, but it is so much faster to do it this way. And yeah, you have to be careful when you move that object around later on, because then suddenly that ADCD reappears because you didn't move the white square with it, but you can group it together if you want to, which is great. But for me, it's another advantage of using a white background. So kind of talk about this. So one is the animations. Right? Yeah, they're fun. But see, if I let that keep going through the whole slide and where it was bouncing the whole time, you would be dizzy and you wouldn't hear anything I would say, right? So you can use them and they're good for like highlighting things, but make them stop, all right? Make them stop. And don't use them on every slide, right? just use them for highlighting things or you want to emphasize something. Okay. I had one colleague, and he had just discovered this new thing. They used to have things where every time something appeared, you could have some animation, and it would be this burst of flame, and it would reappear. And clearly, he had just discovered this on his laptop. And so the whole talk was like that. Every single bullet point that appears, there was this burst of flame, and then the bullet point would appear. And it was kind of funny for the first 3 or 4 slides, but it got kind of odorous after that. So, yeah. All right. I mentioned this before, that the resolution and most importantly the contrast of projectors are terrible with respect to your laptop screen, right? And so this is what I'm trying to say. Your laptop screen is not the same as what you see up here. And especially if you do things like this, where you have a micrograph. Micrographs really do not show up very well on projectors. And you often have to increase the contrast considerably to make things obvious, right? Because often it's a subtle color thing, right? The colors on a projector are just terrible, right? They're really washed out. And so you have to really be careful about that, all right? And you may want to test it on some different projectors. Yeah. The things like this as well, you place this in, but now it's really tiny, it's hard to see. And so this looks fine on a laptop. This slide looks fine on laptops, but when you put it up here, I don't know if you guys can even read this, maybe you can, but it's really hard to see, okay? So one of my pieces of advice is to actually take your slides and print them out so they're like 6 on a page, right? And then hold it, can you read it? Right? Can you see it? Can you read it? Right? And printers often have pretty poor contrast as well. The images are much better, right? So it's one way to kind of simulate just the poor contrast and difficulty to see with projectors. And nowadays with different Grammarly or whatever, typos look really bad, especially in huge fonts that I'm recommending you to put in things. Yeah, they look really quite bad. So you really want to go through your slides and make sure you don't have any typos. Right. So these are more kind of my pet peeves here. So we're getting into the details here. So tables. So a lot of people put up tables like this, and they're like, "Oh, but I don't expect you to look at all this. I just want you to look at this column." Like, why did you put that up there? Right. And then if we're using a visual graphical presentation, why are you giving me numbers? Why don't you give me a bar graph, or why don't you give me a line graph, right? So I took this data is the same as this data, and you can't even work your way through this. Maybe you could get through one line by the time I change the slide, but all of this information here is here, right? And it's in a more understandable format. I can take it all in because it's done graphically. So really, if you're going to give us a table, I would say 2 columns, 2 rows, that's it, right? But think about it. Can you present this in a graphical way? A bar graph, right? A line graph, a 3D graph, right? When you do putting plots like this, right, you need to give the audience enough information so they understand what it is. So you have to have labels on your axes. The labels should have units, right? Because these are important. The conclusion could be very different, whether this is in kilocalories or calories or joules or kilojoules or EV, right? We could come to very different conclusions based on that. And if this isn't in here, they can't make that conclusion. Try to use as large fonts as you can. I don't like legends, just because with a legend, you have to go over here and then interpret that and then go back here. You're going back and forth. If you can put that information directly onto the data set, then you're not going back and forth. I have to translate this by looking at this legend, then I have to go over here. And by that time, the slide has changed. All right, it just slows them down. So to me, I'm not a big fan of legends. line thicknesses. So you really want the defaults on most graphing programs are pretty narrow. You really want much thicker lines in most cases. If it looks too thick, that's probably perfect, right? So we often use these kind of concept and schematic representations. Those are really good for help telling your story, but remember you want to back them up with data, right? Like we talked about this. It's very easy to show too much data or data with no context or explaining what problems or questions it answers, right? Then really, when you, like, for example, if you're showing a spectra, you don't need to show the whole spectra. You're often showing like one or two peaks, right? And how do those one or two peaks, how they change? And so we can ignore the rest of it, right? You can just show us that crop that part that we need to look at, right? And make sure that this is not just for spectra, but especially for Tumblr. You know, you've probably been working this project. You did something collaborative with your research advisor. He or she may have given you some slides for the introduction, or you know, make sure you understand. And then they give you this really nice schematic representation, or you've pulled some data in from the literature. Make sure you understand everything that's on this slide that you put there. So you put the slide there, you put that information there. You should be able to explain anything about it. All right. So and if you cannot, don't put it there. And the advice is, don't give them the stick to hit you with, right? This is, whatever's up here is what they're going to ask questions about, right? That's their starting point. If you give them things that you don't understand, you are just, making your own problem, okay? And it also looks really bad if in your own talk, you put something on a slide and you can't explain it. Let's see. So humor, I mean, I don't think you're the funniest person, but humor's good, keeps people engaged, but it can also be kind of tricky, right? Depending on what people think is funny and what people don't think is funny, right? And so, I actually test things out, or I'll practice them, obviously. And I don't want to get too many spontaneous jokes out there because it can go down quite quickly. Although I know people who have purposely put jokes in that were totally inappropriate as well. So that can go both ways. Right. So I can stick to this. So this is really tough. Like, you really want your talk to fall within a very narrow window, and you really don't want to go over, and you don't really want to be short. And that window is pretty short, and that's really hard to hit perfectly, especially when you're starting out. But so, one is to kind of gauge like 1 or 2 minutes a slide, depending on how complex your slides are. And but the biggest problem I would say is, like, when you practice, you say, oh, I practiced, it was an hour, but when you actually give it, it'll be like 35 minutes, right? Somehow you've blown through all of that, right? And you want to kind of try to slow yourself down, and making more slides with the same content, right? Spreading the content out over more slides will slow you down, right? You want to keep an eye on the clock, and then try to pace yourself, and you say, I want to get to slide 15 by 30 minutes or something like that, whatever. And if you are going too quickly, right, I often put in some extra slides, just because I think maybe it's going to go too quickly. Most times now I'm pretty good at gauging it, but I'll put them in anyway, and they're slides that I can skip. They'd be an interesting side story that I could tell often toward the end as time gets tight. And I'll put those slides in, but they're ones that I can just skip if I need to, right? And that helps me get the talk the right way, because I can watch it with 5 and say, oh, I'm not going to do this section, this small section, right? And it's important to have a clock. Like, I was checking the clock at the beginning of this, making sure that it's accurate. The other thing is, like, you end up speaking a lot faster than you will when you practice. And so, you know, you can walk around. I don't walk around that much, but I think it's useful to walk around. It slows you down, right? It also kind of takes the audience's attention, keeps them awake. Right? Then you can stop and take a drink, right? And all of these things, they seem like they take forever. They seem like these huge awkward pauses when you're up here, but they're really not that long. You know, if I take a drink, it's not great that much, but it just helps me slow down. And so, you know, and then also with interruptions, like people might ask questions or there might be other interruptions. Most times they actually speed you up because you forget to say stuff, right? And so, you know, yeah, you want to practice, but just remember your practice times tend to be much longer than what really happens when you give the talk. Now, this doesn't, for example, in the oral exam or something like that, that's a little bit different because you're going to be interrupted quite a lot. And so, in fact, you probably want to have a shorter presentation, but the expectation is going to be interrupted quite a lot, right? But this is kind of talking about ones where you're not going to have those types of interruptions. So, you really want to, if you can, get to the room that you're going to give the presentation in and just check everything out, right? Where do you plug in your computer? How do you turn on the projector, right? How do I get my computer to show my presentations? Do I need an adapter, right? Is there a plug that I can plug my computer on so that it doesn't run out of power, right? Say, for microphones, like, I mean, a lot of the presentations you might give are in a small space, but even then, ideally you're trying to talk to the person in the last row, right? And that's kind of awkward when you start out, you're like, I'm way too loud. It sounds way too loud to me. I don't think I've been to a talk where it's been too loud, right? It's pretty rare, right? So, but yeah, if you feel like you're not gonna be loud enough, you wanna have a microphone. How do you work that microphone? How do you attach it? Do you have a pocket or a belt to clip it onto? Are you gonna have to hold it the whole time? You know, these types of logistics you really want to be ready and prepared for, right? Because you have enough to worry about with the other things. If you can do this beforehand, it's quite helpful. Sometimes you cannot, right? But if you get there a few minutes early, try to set yourself up, okay? Just be aware that a lot of projectors don't go to the edge, or the edge goes off the screen. We've had this happen for a number of the job talks where their titles are way up here and they just got cut off, right? So just be aware. I try not to go too far to the edge just for that reason. I keep the edge kind of clean. But it also helps if you can get to the room and check that specific projector. All right, so just be aware that, oh, it looked fine on my screen, but the projector only goes up to here, right? And that stuff on the bottom is just reference. I'm going to have this back. Some more logistical things like this: how do I turn on and off the lights? You know, is there a clock? Where do you stand? So actually, at the beginning and start, I moved this because otherwise I'd be pinned out here, right? And I didn't feel that was very comfortable. I wanted to a little bit here so I could turn and look at this, all right? And so, you know, where are you going to stand? You know, kind of think about that. I'm going to stand here. I'm going to stand over there. Am I going to use a remote to do the slide? Do I need to be really close over here so I can change my slides? Bring a pointer, okay? They'll probably provide you a pointer, but it's best if you bring your own because then you can practice and be comfortable with your pointer. If it's somebody else's pointer, you don't know where the buttons are. You're going to push the wrong buttons and have to wait until the top, right? So then you can, if you bring your own, you can practice with your pointers. For many things, especially for things that are exam things, you want to bring markers or chalk for questions. And actually, this happened the first time I gave a talk. My computer wouldn't connect for some reason. And I was lucky because I had my phone and I could run my presentation off my phone. And so the last time I gave this talk, I gave it off my phone, right? But you should have a backup, right? Because your computer might die. It's best to have it like on a USB stick. But honestly, like nowadays you can do most things with your phone if you have the right adapter. Okay, take that. Bang. So come prepared. So in terms of practice, I don't think people give themselves enough time to practice, so they're too busy making their talk and what's going to go into it, but you really want to give yourself enough time to practice, right? Because especially if you're new to giving a talk, that's what I would do. I was making my talk until the last minute, and I hadn't really practiced, and I really needed to practice. I needed as much practice as possible. And if possible, try to find an audience to practice to, that's the best thing. But if you're going to practice alone, do it while you're standing, right? And so you simulate and then try to project, right? Lock yourself in a room and you'll be way louder than you should be probably, but that's better practice. Just getting comfortable hearing your own voice very loudly, right? It's very uncomfortable for most people, but you just have to kind of get used to it. And so if you practice, then, and hopefully if you have an audience, they can give you some feedback, right? So the worst thing is you do it and then they're like, oh yeah, it was fine. That's not helpful, right? There's always things that you can improve. Try to find those people who are really critical or can give you feedback, right? Those people are quite valuable. Buy them food, buy them beer. Try to get them to see your, So this is maybe a little controversial, but I recommend not memorizing your talk. So, and the reason is like if you get disrupted sometimes, it's hard to get started back up from the point that you're like, where did I, and it then, so it's hard to continue if you memorize. The only, and it's really, if you organize your talk properly, the slides will kind of give the talk for you. You like turn the slide, it's like, oh yeah, this is the next thing in my story, right? And then they'll go on and on. And it should kind of give the talk for you. And the one exception is that definitely when I gave my job talk, I was extremely nervous. And so I would actually memorize the first 2 or 3 slides just so I could get it through. And I think the beginning was quite hard because it was not my research. It was kind of giving the context to the research and wider background and what word I was going to use and how I was going to say that. So, I actually memorized the first 2 or 3 slides when I did that. And just to get myself going, right? But just relying. So I'm not the most excited person, but if I sound really monotone, or if I'm clear that this is not where I want to be and what I want to be doing, that becomes very apparent when you're giving a talk, right? And so, enthusiasm, walking around is comfortable, just something to kind of show that you're excited about it, okay? And I think that's very infectious, so people will have a better impression of your talk. And this is one part that's hard for me. It's like a lot of people, when they're giving the talk, they're doing it like this, right? They're just looking at the screen and they're talking. And so there's 2 problems with that. Like one, it's harder to hear because you're projecting into the screen, right? And the other is like a large part of communicating is like eye contact, right? And so I find that kind of disturbing sometimes. So, or I would say you start to see all kinds of strange things going on in the room, like the person over there sleeping, the person over there not paying attention, there's some kind of conversation going on back there. So to try to kind of mitigate that, what I end up doing is like I'll pick like a couple people throughout the room, and I don't know if you've noticed this, but I'll pick 1 or 2 people throughout the room and I'll say, oh, that person's really paying attention. And so I'll try to give the talk to them, right? And that really helps me kind of focus in and be able to talk to the audience, right? Pointers. So pointers are good, but remember pointers should be off most of the time. We see people like this, and you're in the audience going, oh no, it's swinging this way or that way, and oh my God, and they're like getting excited, and the pointer's going around everywhere, and it's like really dangerous, So yeah, it should be off most of the time. You should not and, and it's not like you going like this for every single line, right? You're just trying to highlight one or two things, like you'll circle or underline things, right? And especially if you haven't done it a lot, if you do it fast, you can't really tell. But if you do it really slow, like you can tell it, no matter how still you're going to be shaky. And it looks really obvious how nervous you are, especially when you do that. And so if you're really shaky, like you can't even hold it like this, like I use two hands, right, to try to be less shaky. And if that doesn't help, you just hold your two hands against your body. And so then you move your whole body kind of, right? Like, because when it's like this and you proceed, that nervousness goes out to the audience, right? So, we talked most about all of these. So questions. So answering questions, that's tricky, right? Because it's a wild card. You don't know what people are going to ask, right? So sometimes you just don't understand what they're asking, and you have more time than you think. So you can kind of just stop and think about the question, or if you just don't understand what they're asking, you can ask them to clarify the question, right? Or you can say, I think you said this. Maybe that's not what they said, but that's a question you're going to answer, all right? All right. So you kind of reword their question, right? These are very, a lot of times they'll just go on some tangent and I don't know what the question is. I have no idea what the relevance is. And I'll just kind of reinforce something I said earlier, right? Not really sure. You don't want to insult the person, give you the question, but you can kind of turn the question into something you've already said, right? And you definitely have more time than you think up here. So you can stop and think about it. All right. Is it? Great. So I think I could just a little bit over, but so last piece of advice, right? So when you give a presentation, your research should be the main character, the main thing that you talked about in your presentation. For most presentations that you give, I think you should try to, go for try to teach, inform, tell a story, right? Connect the different things that you tell them about, the different pieces of data that you show. Give yourself time to practice and get comfortable with your presentation. I know when I did my job talk, I was pretty nervous the first 3 or 4 times, and I could feel it, my voice would crack and stuff like that. And I remember telling the first time I did it, I was and you often meet with students afterwards and you go, I thought that was really pretty bad because I felt really nervous, and I think the audience, they were like, no, you were way better than the last person. I don't know what the last person did, but I got better. I noticed that as I gave that same talk over and over again, I got more and more comfortable with that same talk, and by the 4th or 5th time, I was actually kind of having fun with it, right? And I felt like I'm more in command up here. And so, my biggest piece of advice is practicing, right? So the more you practice a thing, the more you become comfortable hearing your own voice, you are more comfortable with your slides, right? And how you're going to say things, right? And so that would be my biggest. And it can be fun. It can actually be fun. If someone told me this when I was in graduate school, I would be like, this is never going to be fun. I mean, I would say that when I got here, I would say, teaching was the most terrifying thing because you have to present but all the time. I was probably one lesson ahead of the students, right? And so, yeah, it was pretty terrifying, I think. But if someone told me, that you'll enjoy it now, I would not have believed that at all. So, but it can be, I think. So that's it for my talk. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions. Yes.
So, God forbid that you actually don't know the answer to what a person is asking. How would you go about, making such an attempt at it?
So,
That's it.
and there's a couple of different ways. Like, maybe I'll say like, I never thought about it from that point of view, or I never thought about it that way. This is how I thought about it. That's kind of the diversion tactic. Sometimes it's one of the reasons that you do give these talks sometimes is to get that feedback. You're like, oh, that's really interesting. I never thought about it that way. That's something I need to think about, and I think that could be quite useful. And acknowledge that was a really good question, But I think you're talking more about like if you're in an oral examination or something like that, and they're asking you something, and you're like, I don't know the answer to this, So usually what will happen is they'll try to lead you to the answer. So pay attention, right? So pay attention. They'll try to lead you to the answer because you get so flustered, you stop listening, right? So just kind of pay attention. They'll usually try to lead you to the answer. And, hopefully they'll drop some hints and drop the breadcrumbs, and hopefully you're paying attention, you can follow along, right? And in that type of situation.
So sorry. So you said that if you enter can have extra slides, if we're running out of time, how do we skip them?
Oh, you skip them, you just walk across.
Oh,
Just go right over them. Like they'll see them, right? But you're like, okay, I don't have enough time to talk about this part of my project, so if you flip through them. It used to be that we gave overheads, and nobody knew that you skip things because you would just you would skip some overheads and then go to the next one. And what was nice about the overheads was that you could watch the audience and say, oh, they're not interested in this, and you would just move to the next topic. Or you as you're talking, you're like, oh, I should explain it this way. You can pull things, you could do things out of order. Like nowadays with slides, that's more difficult to do. It's more obvious when you do it, but yeah, you just kind of slip over to show how we. And the audience is like, oh, we're not going to sit here for 30 minutes. Thank you, that's it. Any other questions? I will post this up. I think there is a version of this up online. I think it's almost exactly the same. All right, Skip?
And often these are preparing for presentations. Like how much? Yes.
It really depends on so at this stage, I don't think I'm a good person to answer the question because I honestly feel like the best talks are the ones that I literally just finished making while I was sitting down because it's all in my head because it's still a lot there. The worst ones nowadays are ones that I took a talk that I gave 3 or 4 months ago, and oh yeah, what's the next slide? I'm not really sure, right? So, yeah, what's good advice? It depends on what it is. If it's for a conference, it's going to be pretty short. You can probably get away with doing that. I don't know. It depends on how fast you're making slides and how comfortable you are with this. That's going to differ a lot from person to person. But the more, basically, start as early as you can. That would be my advice. Like you really can't over prepare, and don't underestimate the practice time. I think that's a lot of people forget about practicing. Any other questions?
Right. It's time.
But this I think these actually difficult likes, so I just send me in to argue with that.